It was a typical Friday night when something strange happened to me while I was doing DoorDash after my college classes. I used to do this on weekends to cover my living expenses, but that night felt different. There were fewer orders, and the ones that came through were low-paying, basically a waste of time. After about an hour, I finally received an order that seemed decent but was 8 miles away. The payment was good, but the location felt a little off. However, it was better than the low-paying ones, so I accepted it without much thought, picked up the bag from the restaurant, and started driving. The GPS said the journey would take 30 minutes, which was longer than any of my previous orders. Past the campus, there were a lot of houses, but after 20 minutes of driving, I found myself surrounded by open fields and farmland. There were no houses, just fields swaying in the wind. I started to feel a bit nervous, but I reassured myself that everything would be fine. Among the empty fields, I saw a house that matched the location on the GPS. I figured this was where the delivery was supposed to go. The eerie silence of the place spoke volumes. As I drove down the deserted road towards the house, I couldn't shake the strange feeling. Even though I'm not easily scared, a sense of unease crept over me. The only sound was the faint rumble of my car. I parked, prepared the bag, and stepped out. The house was quiet, and there was very little light, just the porch light to illuminate the area. I walked through the overgrown grass to the porch and knocked on the door, waiting. I glanced back at my car, which seemed to disappear into the darkness of the field. A moment passed. I knocked again, but there was no response, no sound from inside. It didn't take long for me to realize that something wasn't right. The windows were dark, and they looked decayed upon closer inspection. I figured this order wasn't going to be completed. The weird thing was, there was a light on, but no one seemed to be there. I looked at the porch light and thought, why is this the only light? Then I noticed that the top part of the light was powered by a cheap solar battery. It was a self-charging light that would turn on automatically in the evening, meaning no one needed to be present to turn it on. Just as I was piecing everything together, I heard the rumble of a car behind me. I turned around and saw a vehicle driving down the dirt path, stopping just behind my car. I stood still, watching their headlights. A man stepped out of the car. From the porch, I yelled, asking if this was his order, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, unmoving and silent. A rush of adrenaline hit me as I realized how terrifying the situation had become. The silence of the night only reminded me that no one was around to help. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, stuck between an empty house and a stranger. In a moment of panic, I dropped the bag and bolted, running as fast as I could across the field behind the house. I could hear the man chasing me, his footsteps pounding like a madman. The grass grew thicker and taller as I ran, my breath getting shorter. After a while, I realized he couldn't keep up anymore. I slowed down, trying to catch my breath, cautiously moving forward through the fields. I forced myself to stay quiet, knowing he might still be searching for me. Eventually, I reached a road, collapsing in fear. The police found me there and took me in for questioning. But by the time we returned, the man was gone. To my surprise, my car wasn't looted, and the delivery bag was still on the porch. That could only mean that the man's intentions were far worse than robbery. This happened when I was 18, making the long journey from my home to college. I was getting more exhausted by the minute. Around 10 p.m., I decided to stop at the next gas station. 10 minutes later, I pulled into a station that seemed to be in the middle of nowhere. There were just a few pumps and a small store. I saw no other cars on the road, nor any houses or buildings nearby. I drove up to a pump and got out to fill my tank. As I looked around, I froze when I noticed a strange man approaching me. He was much bigger than me, probably around 50 years old, and he looked homeless, but he was the only person around. His faint smile only added to my fear. "Do you need something?" I asked, hoping he wouldn't come any closer. The man stopped a few feet from my car and carefully looked around before speaking. "Just get back on the highway," he said, pointing towards the exit where I had come from. Hey, I was confused. but I responded with, "Okay." He walked away, but I still didn't understand why he wanted me to take the highway again. It was a one-way road. Was he suggesting I drive the wrong way and make a U-turn back onto the main highway? It didn't make sense. I looked towards the exit, which had no construction signs or anything blocking the road. It just looked like an empty ramp. As I finished pumping gas and got into my car, I glanced back at the man who was now sitting by the convenience store. The more I thought about it, the crazier he seemed, spouting nonsense. I figured it might have been a trap, so I drove towards the highway entrance. As I approached, I noticed all the streetlights were out. I slowed down, thinking it might be a construction zone. Suddenly, a pickup truck appeared out of nowhere and stopped right in front of my car. Every door flung open, and 4 people jumped out, each armed with knives and other weapons. They started sprinting toward my car, not even bothering to cover their faces. Their cold, emotionless expressions terrified me. I immediately threw my car in reverse, backing away as fast as I could, with them just feet away. I saw dozens of people coming out from the roadside. Some even tried chasing my car. I quickly turned around and sped off, escaping. When I felt safe, I called 911, but for some reason, they never called back, and I never got any updates. It was as if they didn't even investigate. I've always wondered if the old man at the gas station was warning me, trying to save me from those people. I count myself lucky, because I still don't know who they were, or what their true intentions were. I want to say that I was around, for a very small incident in my life, I want to say that I was around 15 or 16 years old at the time. I lived in a fairly small house in Vermont. My family didn't stay there for long. It was located in the woods and was quite far from almost everything you'd need to leave the house for. It was quite inconvenient. However, while I was living there, I had an experience in that house that I will probably never forget. It happened in January, and I only remember that because it was a few days after New Year's. My cousin Jason and I were both on school holidays at the time, and we had planned to spend the night at my house. It was something we often did. Usually, we'd stay up until 2 or 3 in the morning playing Xbox. This all happened in the living room. That night, we were watching a movie. I can't remember what movie it was, but that's not important. What I do remember is that about halfway through the movie, Jason kept looking out the window on the right side of where we were sitting. It got to the point where, every other minute, I could see his head turn toward the window out of the corner of my eye. Now I should mention that there was a pretty nasty snowstorm going on that night. At first, I thought he was watching the snow fall, until I realized how long he had been staring out the window. I asked him what he was looking at. He kept staring, and then replied that he thought he saw something. That immediately filled me with worry. I think it was mostly because wild animals weren't common where we lived, and as I mentioned before, we didn't really live near anything. So the fact that something, or someone, was on our property, especially at this hour and in the middle of a snowstorm, was concerning. For a few minutes, nothing happened. I kept asking him strange questions, but he just told me to be quiet, as if he was trying to focus. Then, we both saw it, the clear shadow of a person darting from one tree to another. Our hair stood on end. There was no sound, but the sight alone was enough to freak us out. But this happened about 200 feet away from the house, so we couldn't tell if the person was getting closer or not. We both looked at each other, then back out the window. A few more minutes passed before it happened again, but this time, the figure was further to the left of where it had been the first time. As time passed, it became clear that there was more than one person. Then one figure emerged from behind a tree, but instead of darting behind another tree, it just stood there. A few seconds later, the figure started sprinting, this time in our direction. That was enough to snap us out of the frozen state of disbelief we were in.
I ran upstairs to wake my dad, and by the time he was up and followed,
That was enough to snap us out of the frozen state of disbelief we were in.
I ran upstairs to wake my dad, and by the time he was up and followed me downstairs, Jason
Both Jason and I explained what we saw. Normally, I don't think my dad would have believed us, but I think he could see the real panic in our eyes. We all walked around the house, double-checking that all the doors and windows were locked. After that, my dad grabbed a weapon and went outside. He circled the house but didn't find anything that night. We convinced him to sleep in the living room with us, and by morning, the snowstorm had almost completely stopped. We went outside to assess the situation in the daylight. That's when we found several footprints in the snow next to the trees in front of the living room window. They had filled in quite a bit from the storm, but the footprints were still clearly visible and identifiable. There were even some tracks around the house, overlapping the ones my dad had made the previous night. I talked to my dad about it, and he said that when he went outside, those tracks weren't there. What made it even more disturbing was that our shed had been left completely open, and the only thing that was stolen was one of the hunting knives we used. That was enough for my dad to call the police. He didn't call 911 because it wasn't urgent, but we kept an eye on things. 2 weeks later, we moved out of that house, not because of the incident, but it happened to be around the time we had already planned to relocate. I was extremely grateful for that. At least as far as I know, nothing else happened in those 2 weeks. The whole experience still haunts me. To this day, seeing several people lurking around a secluded property in the middle of the night and during a snowstorm feels like something straight out of a nightmare. I try my best not to think about it. This happened to me and a few friends in the winter of 2014. At that time, I was 13 years old, and it was the scariest and most dangerous situation I had ever been in.